You'll grow from it. You'll be a better person because of it. And if that doesn't work, God made me do it.
Son of a...
Welcome back to the Dirty Work Podcast. Boys, let's cheers. Ready for this one? Evil. And the problem thereof.
It's going to be a fun episode.
This is going to be a very, very important episode for all my friends listening. We're going to be tackling the problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering? Why do babies get cancer? Right?
Yo, why did I have to hit Will?
Yeah, why did you have to hit me?
It's the problem of evil. It's a question as old as...
As old as time, as old as Epicurus.
So, problem of evil.
Yeah.
Alex, can I throw it to you right away? Is that okay? Or Danny?
Go for it.
Kind of talk to us maybe why are we talking about the problem of evil? This is something that's been long talked about in the Christian community. This is nothing new. Many philosophers have debated it for years. If you're wondering, if you're asking the question, why evil? Can God exist without evil? You're not the first one to ask this question. Yeah. You're not going to be the last, and we're not going to be the only ones that ever struggle with this question. But it's a good one, so we're going to talk about it a little bit. And we want to go through a couple theodicies. We'll explain kind of what those mean. A couple of philosophical questions, and maybe we want to say options of what could be and how God could exist and evil exist, how they could coexist. Many different things that we're going to be talking about today. And it's not going to be an exhaustive list. We can go on and on and on. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the term theodicy, which he mentioned, is a fancy term to basically mean, like, a defense for God's existence in spite of the fact that evil and suffering exists in the world. So this, again, was coined originally, I guess, by Epicurus, who lived in about 340 BC. So almost 350 years before Christ. So
Popular guy on this podcast, I'd say, too. I think we've mentioned him. This might be the third time.
We mentioned him a lot. He was kind of the father of... He's an atheist, materialist, empiricist, who kind of became the father of hedonism, right? He kind of, like, was like, well, you know, eat, drink, and be merry. Yep. If God doesn't exist, then it sounds kind of honestly like Jordan Peterson, not to blast Jordan Peterson here because he's one of our favorites, but kind of that idea that the goal of life is to alleviate suffering, right?
And you might remember that people listening from our podcast on different schools of philosophy, thoughts of morality, that sort of thing. We mentioned that before. Alleviate the absence of suffering from the body, from the mind. That's a good life.
Yeah,
that's how you know.
And that's kind of the essence behind hedonism. Sometimes hedonism gets a bad rap as these sensualists going around for pleasure, but that kind of idea is suffering sucks, and so let's try and live with as little suffering as possible for yourself and your neighbor. All that to say is he posed this question. So again, to say it in his wording is this. He says, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not all powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then where does evil come from? Is he neither willing? And if he's neither able or willing, then why call him God?" So again, it's kind of like, well, if there's evil in the world, then how can God be all good if he would stop it? And if he is all good and he's powerful enough to stop it, then in what way could evil exist?
Yeah, and we see this in, I think it's known as the logical problem with evil. There's two problems with evil that we'll get into, but the first one is the logical problem. It's pretty much... I don't want to say it's been resolved by philosophers, but it's one it's easier to tackle. Now, depending on where you come to that conclusion, it leads into other questions and problems. But yeah, it's the logical problem of evil. Why is there evil? Why is there all manners of bad stuff? A theist, in the simplest terms, someone who believes in God, would say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent.
Yeah. So all-knowing.
Yes.
Omnipotent. Just breaking it down because we have Presbyterians who listen.
That's right.
We got to break it down a little bit. So,
the Prezzies, yes.
Omniscient means all-knowing, omnipotent, not omnipotent.
Yeah.
No.
I did have a professor at school actually pronounce it like that.
God's word can be potent sometimes.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. But it did make me... So omnipotent...
It's like maybe I don't trust you as much as I thought.
All-powerful, and then what was the omnipresent?
It's like saying photograph.
Omnibenevolent.
All good.
All good.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so...
Unlike the infinite Angelina Jolie, who's...
Omnimalevolent.
Yeah.
That was good. That was cool. So anyways, typical theist, that would be the 3 points that you would fall. You're
We're rolling today.
Give me these dreamy eyes.
I love it.
I love
dude.
it,
This
man.
is a good podcast.
So the atheist,
Dreamy eyes.
Angelina Jolie, the atheist would say, right?
Yeah.
The atheist would say, well, here's the contradiction. Evil is bad. So you can't have a God that's, can you have a God who is all-knowing? If he is all-knowing, then he would be powerful enough to stop evil.
Mm-hmm.
If he's powerful enough to stop evil, why doesn't he do it, right? And so a lot of theists might cave at that point and be like, well, maybe we'll take away one of these attributes from him. Maybe he's not all good, but he is all powerful. Or maybe he's all good, but maybe he can't stop it. And so you run into all these issues. But that's probably the biggest argument between theists and atheists. It's atheists saying, well, it contradicts itself, so you're going to have to lose something. And that thing you're going to have to lose is God.
Yeah.
You're going to have to lose a certain attribute of God.
And I almost wonder off the bat, too, how much is, like, you're thinking of Epicurus here in his Greek, the Greek mindset being rather dualistic at times, heavy on the dualism, heavy on determinism. You almost wonder, too, just as he's laying out this argument, and even Will, as you mentioned here, there with even modern atheists today, there does seem to be sort of a lack of the idea of, well, God can exist in light of the problem of evil because we have the theodicy of free will, which is something that we'll dive into. But what is interesting, too, is just this idea that determinism, like we've spoken about a little bit before in this podcast, and we're really hoping to dive into more, has crept into the minds of Christians, I'd say especially in the West sometimes with modern evangelicalism, sort of this neo-Gnostic idea of determinism, but thinking, okay, well, if God exists, how can there be evil? And if he does exist and there's evil, it must be because he's not, again, omnibenevolent, or there's something, something is tricky going on with that. There's a breakdown. But I think looking at the theodicy, having a proper theodicy of free will, it doesn't maybe emotionally, if you're going through these, if you're going through suffering, it doesn't satiate all of those problems. But to have a coherent frame of thinking and worldview, a proper theodicy of free will, which we see that there are large sects of evangelicalism that don't have a proper theodicy of free will, which I think is a problem, is necessary because it clears up these issues, I think. Not that it's all neat and tidy just with one sentence, but actually working through these and thinking through these. I think a proper theodicy like that really helps.
And let's, briefly, we'll state that a lot of this, it's a head and a heart issue. And this might not be hitting, for the listener, maybe this isn't hitting your head. Maybe this isn't, you're hearing this, or you're going to be hearing this, and maybe it still doesn't sit right with you. And it's easy to form the arguments and to, even for someone who, for me, I can say that I'm pretty firm on the stance that I take with this. And I feel like through studying the fathers and just through having wiser people than me pour into me,
that's us.
That's not 100% not you. That's most of my Presbyterian friends.
He's referring to us.
I am not.
Former Presbyterians is what he meant. Which is us.
But through that, even though I can formulate an argument in my head, when you're actually going through the issues, it's so much harder to align your heart with that. And so I think I can speak for us where we want to be sensitive to that and understand that it's not always so easy to make your heart and your head line up perfectly.
Just because we could possibly justify a reason for suffering doesn't alleviate the pain that it feels going through suffering. So we aren't at all going to take away from that, but we're going to kind of hit a few of these different points.
With that said, I'm ready to steam.
We're about to jump in. We're going to explain to you that basically this idea that, and that's kind of what he was saying, there's the logical problem that this causes, but there's also kind of an emotional or like an evidential problem this causes. So again, we're going to try and argue that it is not logically, they are not at logical, what am I trying to say? At odds with one another. What's that term?
What are you ever trying to say?
What am I trying to say? They are not at odds with one another logically. That if evil exists, then God cannot.
Yeah.
That's just something that we would not be able to prove. And so no atheist has really to this point been able to prove that. And so we're going to kind of give some arguments as to why, and why we can hold very strongly to a belief in a God, despite the fact that we live in the same world as you, and we see the same suffering you do.
And again, this is not by far the only one to say this, but C.S. Lewis does have that popular quote, right? You know what a crooked line looks like because you've seen a straight line. So in some sense, he goes on to say, the problem of evil is a problem in light of a Christian worldview.
Yeah, right.
We can maybe you can say in a theistic worldview, but you would then, I think, have to venture to say a loving theistic worldview. And so I think one of our podcasts is going to be why it makes the most sense that the Christian, the historical Christian God makes the most sense for a proper view of the world. But it really is a problem because we have this idea consciously that the world, when we see evil and suffering, that's not, I'll at least say evil. That's not the original intention. That's not the way the world should be.
No.
And then I think, too, we have written on our hearts the law of God's love that he doesn't want evil to prosper, and it won't ultimately. But it's a problem of evil because our culture is inundated with Christian values. And then also, I think our very being is, since it's created in the image of God, inundated with the divine spark.
Yeah, you could say kind of like, if you ask someone, does evil exist? You're probably going to get a unanimous yes. Well, then you could say, well, does good exist? And they'll say, well, yeah. And then you say, well, that implies some form of moral law, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you're kind of saying is, and if there's a moral law, you have to imply some form of lawgiver. There has to be something external to humanity which gives that law by which we follow. And so if you assume the intrinsic worth of a person, such as yourself or someone else, which is basically what's being argued in the problem of evil. It's
you don't find the intrinsic worth of a person under a rock.
Yeah.
You don't find the intrinsic worth of a person under a microscope.
No, exactly. So it's like, oh, babies shouldn't suffer. Why?
Yeah.
Why are babies intrinsically valuable? If you believe in strict materialist empiricism, where it's just a bunch of atoms, but just a bunch of particles randomly mutating and selecting each other, then if the baby is deformed, you hope it dies, right? Because then that gives way to...
We've had cultures that do that.
Well, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like,
yes. So all to say is the argument, what's ironic is they're trying to use the problem of evil to almost eradicate a god, when in reality you need a god in the first place to even have the problem.
Yeah.
Just to start off.
See you guys.
And that's the end of the podcast.
I'm out. That was good. I thought
kidding,
something
we're
happened
back.
for a
Welcome back.
Yeah.
This is Dirty Word Part 2.
This is Angelina Jolie and the problem of evil.
The problem of Angelina.
So do we want to dive into free will defense?
I think let's dive into
Is
the
that okay?
odyssey of free will.
Free will was probably the strongest and probably my favorite.
Definitely the most popular. To break it down, the free will defense, for those who don't know, is the idea that God, and correct me if I'm totally off base here, but I never am. That God... Oh, okay. God,
Wrong stadium.
Funny how when I say God, you interject right away.
I don't know what you mean by God.
Okay, so God
Define your terms.
maximizes the goodness in the world by creating free beings, and being free means we have the choice to do evil things, which so often we choose.
Yeah.
Now that you're done interrupting, does that sound about right?
That sounded... You stole the base.
It's fine.
Yeah, you got on it.
Like, it was fine. It got the point
You
across.
got on it, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Now, why is having free will important? I think clarifying that really quickly, briefly, if we're going to be looking at a theodicy of free will, it must be important if the God we're ascribes to us free will.
Yeah.
Both of you, what's the importance of that? Why from a perspective when you're looking to encounter God, when you're asking about the Christian God, why historically has Christianity held to a God who values free will?
I mean, I think in real simple terms, God is a God of love, and God is love. God in his essence is love. He is freedom. He is all these things that are good and beautiful and true and worthy. And so the idea that God would be some kind of puppet master that would control his beings has never been held by the church, by the true Church of Jesus Christ, and
Of Latter-day Saints.
of Latter-day Saints. Exactly. This is a Mormon podcast. So the idea that God is intimately involved with you, but he's not pulling your strings so that you do certain things, has been held by the church as what is true and who God is.
We believe in a personal God.
Yes.
And to be personal with something, there needs to be autonomy on the other end, right? If I'm personal with a sock puppet, I'm creepy. That's terrifying. You don't want... Your best friend shouldn't be inanimate.
In many ways.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And God is likewise would not... There's no meaningful relationship found in a marionette, in a puppet of any sort. And so God, in his great love for us, wanted to bestow upon us the greatest joy and love, and therefore had to endow us with some form of will which could choose him voluntarily and thus enter into a true relationship.
And if God breathes his spirit into us,
yes,
right, his very spirit, how could we not be filled with free will?
Yeah.
Right, because actually to say that God doesn't have free will, even in creation, that creation just naturally emanates from God, from a Christian paradigm, is actually a heresy.
Yeah.
I know that, for instance, popular Catholic doctrine would be that not necessarily that God didn't have a choice in creation, but because he is good, creation is the proper thing to do, so he chooses to do it, but it's still a choice. It's not the strict pantheism of just God and creation is one. It sort of emanates from him. So being that we have the very spirit of God as being made in his image, to think that we don't have the free will of our creator because the creator has a free will is also a strange breakdown. And like you guys said too as well, with just love.
Yeah.
It's not loving a marionette. Sock puppet doesn't love you. You can't have a relationship with a sock puppet.
Yeah.
And Christ says, something similar when he says, if you love only those who love you, what credit is that to you? So if God only loves those whom are forced to love him because they don't have the free will to do so.
That's good.
It's him asking us to do something that he doesn't even do himself.
Yeah.
And if that's what he's ascribing as a highly righteous act, when Christ commands his followers to do that, to think that we are more righteous than God in that sense, it's silly. It's a breakdown.
Yeah.
It's an error.
And a good parent would not lock their kid in the room and say, "You need to love me. I'm going to force you to love me." That's not true love.
No,
you wouldn't.
Not past like the age of 7.
Well, Alex wouldn't, but Danny, you might go to Winona and say, "You need to love me." That's true. But a good husband wouldn't say, "You need to love me."
Yeah,
That's
again, not
true
past a
love.
couple years of marriage. Then I think is
exactly right. Yeah, it's the idea that
different strokes, but
your free choice in that. I hope that you choose to love me.
Yep.
But in no way am I going to hold the gun to your head and say you need to.
We will be doing an entire podcast we're going to be releasing on the argument against determinism within Christianity, because there is a sect of Reformed theology who follows some of the teachings of John Calvin, who teach a very deterministic God, a God who chooses for you and does almost marionette you to a bit. So we are going to release an entire podcast, like 2 hours, where we just slam home the argument of free will. So here's not really going to be an argument for free will's existence as much as it being an argument that could explain how evil could exist.
Exactly. So I think it's important to lay just the framework of that, but there's plenty more to come we can't do 2 hours just on this episode.
And to somewhat paraphrase C.S. Lewis again, you might ask the question, well, in what way is God still sovereign if there's a will outside of his own? You know what I mean? And his argument is kind of that, well, imagine if you're a parent, right, and you tell your kids, tidy up your room. You genuinely want the room clean. Your will is that the room is clean, but you have to give the kid the opportunity to clean it himself so that they learn how to be tidy, right?
Yeah.
And so if you come upstairs and the teddy bear's on the ground and there's crayon on the walls and the bed's not made, that is against your will. But ironically, it's your own decision to give them will which caused it.
Sure.
So it's your sovereignty which actually allowed your will not to take place.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's taking place with God, where he has set up a certain rule to life, and he has given us basically free reign of how to live. So while he desires righteousness, he desires love, he desires community, we create evil and suffering, and it's against his will, while it's actually his will which allows it in the first place.
Sure,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think with some of, like you said, certain sects of Reformed doctrine who want to ascribe to God ultimate power, they view him allowing things to happen that are outside of his desire for us as taking away from him. But I think it's a category error, like you said, because who is ultimately providing us with the ability to have the free will? It's God. You're not taking anything away from him. I think what the deterministic worldview does is actually ascribe qualities to God that are evil. You're adding something to God that I don't think you should be doing.
You would never say that the mom is like out of control in that moment. She could clean the room herself, and to then say, "Oh, in order to save the mom's face, basically, we're going to then attribute her for the messy room and say the mom's responsible for the messy room."
Yeah.
No. That's ridiculous. If you know what I mean, and I wouldn't want to believe in a mom who goes around trashing her kids' rooms.
Yeah.
No.
So
They're out there.
this theodicy of free will, or the free will defense, I think, as it's called, it says that God didn't create evil, but in eliminating evil, it would deprive us of our free will, which God has seemed to deem as the greatest good, to give us free will. I don't get it. Like, I don't understand it. I don't understand why he'd give us free will instead of just making us choose good every now and then, or every now and then, all the time, just every couple times. I don't get it, but I trust that that's his greatest plan. the problem I think with the free will defense is that it addresses the problem of moral evil. Why do we do evil things? Why do people kill babies in the womb? Why do terrorists fly the planes in the buildings? It addresses the problem with moral evil
of people with agency.
Of
Beings
agency,
with agency.
yes. Of evil committed by people on purpose. I don't think it addresses the problem with natural evil, right? The idea of, tectonic shifts in the world and earthquakes and tornadoes and why that storm dropped that tree on the house. It doesn't address that. In my mind, from what I've studied and from what I've tried to make
real
sense
quick,
of.
and then I'll pass it to you, Alex, because that's a good point too. But possibly not. Although I'm thinking, if you, and I'm going to stumble over my words here, might not be super correct from like an orthodox standpoint, but I'm thinking, if we're taking and I'm going to have to enter into the Christian worldview quick to speak about this, but if we're thinking, okay, a fall of man, a fall into non-being of that we call evil, is brings about sin, evil, and that's an explanation for why beings with agency commit evil, but it doesn't necessarily explain why there's natural evil. It may explain it, however, though, if you take sort of a cosmic view of sin, whereas, let's say, when Scripture describes Adam and Eve's fall, I don't know if it would be correct to say that they're the federal heads of physicality itself, but they're tied to it because they're physical beings. If you ascribe then through that, sin enters the cosmos as a whole and not just people. And that's why I think you could probably read when God curses the ground as, I don't know if you want to say allegorical or something, for the idea that now all of creation has fallen into the non-being of evil. It can explain it, I think, as opposed to like cutting them off and saying, well, sin just affects the people, and then I don't understand the rest of it. Yeah. I know that some people would say, I believe it's... is it Hugh Ross, Dr. Hugh Ross, something like that, would say, like, he's a Christian scientist, not Christian Science, but, scientist is a Christian, thinks that, like, earthquakes would have always been around, just even in a perfect world, so to speak, a non-fallen world, and maybe they just wouldn't have caused the damage. But I think if you view the cosmic sin as affecting all the cosmos on a cosmic level, it does make sense for why there are natural evils, and then when Christ assumes universal human nature, he really redeems all of the cosmos itself because he enters into the world.
And I certainly believe that. And we've all, or I think we've either all read or we're going through Maximus the Confessor, Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ, and that idea that everything is connected. Sin infected every little bit of the cosmos, every DNA strand, every star, and everything is affected.
So when Christ assumes human nature, he sort of assumes physicality as a whole.
So I definitely believe that. But there's something to be said for those who would say, well, it doesn't account for the natural evil. It is harder to maybe argue.
Also, just one interesting worldview, which I think is kind of cool, that's espoused by Athenagoras. I think I pronounced that right. Wait, what is it?
I don't know.
Athenagoras, yeah, dude. Origen, Tertullian, Tatian, Justin Martyr, and Clement of Alexandria.
Tatian was a student of Justin Martyr, correct? I think so. Maybe not?
Maybe. He kind of went a little off.
Yeah, he went off, though. Yeah, he went, once Justin Martyr died, he went into...
You're probably right. He uses a lot of Justin Martyr's quotes and stuff when he's writing. All that to say is they argued that when God appointed the heavens and earth, he appointed angels as ministers over many different elements, such as the stars and the heavens and stuff. And what happened was, it says, and this is a quote from Athenagoras, he says, "The maker and framer of the world distributed and appointed a multitude of angels and ministers to occupy themselves about the elements and the heavens and the world and all things in it, and the godly ordering of them all." He says, "But just as with man, who have freedom of choice for both virtue and vice, it is also the same among angels. Some free agents, you will observe, created by God, continued in those things God had made for them, but some outraged both the constitution of their nature and the government entrusted to them." And so their argument is that the reason the cosmos is falling apart is from the free-willed choice of angels who have apostatized against God, basically, and have therefore thrown the things that they've been entrusted with out of order.
Okay. Got it.
Isn't that interesting?
Got it.
So the cosmos is held up not only by God, but also through the appointment of angels.
Freaking angels.
And then the angels who are basically rebelling against God are turning the areas in which they're in charge of just into chaos.
So he's saying that, am I getting correct, that natural evil is sort of a result because the angels are throwing the elements all out of whack.
Dude, angels
and
not
then,
only...
And then the sin of humans with agency is because of our free will choice.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And
Angels they not only cause earthquakes, right? But they got us to do drugs, psychedelics, as we've established already.
I did lay that out.
Yeah,
I
so
did lay that out.
way to go. 0 for 2, angels.
Who's making this cat sin though? Huh?
My cat is up on my
If you
counter.
want to talk about natural evils, cats.
Here's a good point too. Think about Jesus when he's on the boat with the disciples, right? And the storm is coming.
Yep.
What's he do? He rebukes the wind and the waves. If it was God, he wouldn't be able to rebuke his Father, right? He wouldn't be able to rebuke his own essence, his own Trinity, right?
Okay.
So if God was in charge of the wind and the waves in the first place, causing the storm, he would have no right to rebuke it. Instead, the wind and the waves were acting out of order, out of the natural decision of God, and therefore he had the ability to say, stop it.
And when he says in charge, you're not saying God obviously has control because he rebukes it. But if you're viewing it as God entrusting it to people, to beings who are not adhering to the original design, he steps in.
He has ultimate
rebukes it in that
authority
sense.
over it.
Yep.
At any point, he could snap it into but he has natural laws which govern and maybe appointments of angels, and therefore when things go out of whack, sometimes he just lets it run its course, and sometimes he steps in.
Yeah, and that's been the consensus of the Catholic Church, capital C, the Orthodox Church, is that God is he's outside of the world. He's outside of time, outside of reality. But he is the very source of it. He's independent of the world, but he's the source of it. And so while he may not be all, we can get into this in the latter half of everything, but he's not all controlling as in pulling every single string, but he's intimately involved with everything. And for him to stop physics, thermodynamics, when he created physics, thermodynamics, circle squares, he gave up the possibility of a circular square.
Yep.
And he gave up the possibility of willingly of forcing things to happen. And so that's a very interesting part. We'll get more into that as we go. But yeah, that's good with the. I never thought about that perspective of on the boat. And
That's a good point though, because they kind of one of the premises of this argument against God is that God can create any world he wants to. But that's that's possibly not true in the sense that God cannot force someone to freely choose something.
Yeah.
That's a logical improbability.
Yeah, yep.
It's not that God's not up to the task, it's that the task itself is not.
the argument, can God create a rock that he can't lift?
It's wrong
It's
at
like-
a paradigmatic level.
It's like, well,
Yes.
that's not a real question. That's
Yeah.
not...
Yes.
So if God wanted a personal creation to interact with, he then had to give them choice, and God cannot force free choices just by nature, and therefore God, to some extent, if he truly wants relationship with his creatures, cannot create a world where he forces humanity to act in a certain way.
The moment God created anything outside of himself, he gave up voluntarily a degree of his power.
Yeah.
You could say.
All right.
That was good.
We're talking about free will, the odyssey of free will, why it's important from a Christian worldview, from I think just a worldview in general, free will, why it's important that free will exists. But we also keep mentioning evil, suffering. This thing called evil, is evil even a thing? Does evil exist? I think we need to break that down now that we're really diving into this stuff for all of our friends listening out here. What the heck do we mean when we say evil? What is that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would first off...
Easy question.
I know.
This is you.
Well, let's start off. I mean, I would even just take it one step earlier and say, since evil seems to be something that we're interacting with to some extent, who is the author of this evil?
Got it.
And I would say that the church's standpoint, traditionally, and I would say orthodox speaking, would be God is not the author of evil in any way. Evil exists because we exist. And if you wanted God to wipe out evil, he'd wipe out us in the process. So being like, God, why does God allow evil in the world? It's like, dude, he allows you in the world. That's why evil is in the world.
God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt with.
James 1, right? God cannot tempt. So again, we do not believe in any God which authors any form of evil. Every good and perfect thing comes from the Father, and all good things have their essence in God.
Yep.
Therefore, in the same way as blindness is the absence of sight, or deafness is the absence of sound, or darkness is the absence of light, you never blame the flashlight for the shadow, right? You never blame the sun for the dark spot. And so likewise with God, he's radiating goodness, and the areas where his light does not penetrate, you might argue, is what we call evil.
Yeah.
But it's the absence of something. It's not something which exists.
Yes.
Which is extremely important, because if God created all that exists, and evil exists, then you'd have to basically make the argument that God created evil.
Yep.
And we don't believe that. You know what I mean? And so what we say is that evil does not exist in any aspect in the way other things exist.
And that's important to remember too, because we don't historical Orthodox Christianity does not ascribe to the sort of, again, we'll bring it back, but Epicurean, deistic worldview of a God that's outside of the world entirely. He is transcendent and immanent, but completely outside, and then occasionally mingles with our affairs, but maybe not.
Yeah.
We would ascribe to more something that's like a light or a weak, so to speak, panentheism, that God permeates the whole world. So for something to even exist, it must be flowing through with God himself.
Yes.
And so when we talk about evil, what we're really talking about is a privation of the good, a collapse into non-being, not a dualistic, maybe more Augustinian worldview of good and evil, us two opposing forces, or if you think of something very Gnostic, very Manichaean, two opposing, city of light, city of darkness, opposing. It's not that. There's good, and then there's the absence of good, the privation of it. That we call evil. But evil is so weak in the sight of the good and the beautiful. You can't even say it exists. It's not really a thing.
It's almost, you'd say, like the misuse of a thing, or the misdirection of a thing, or taking
The
your proper
inverse of a
telos.
thing.
Yeah, like there's a
Yep.
telos to creation, a purpose that each person has been given. So if you have a cup, well, you have a certain purpose, right? It's to drink out of it.
Exactly.
And if I use it to smash you over the head, I'm misusing it. You wouldn't argue that it's the fault of the cup, or that even that action. Yeah, I mean, the action is not at all tied to the
If
substance.
this microphone is meant to record audio, amplify your voice,
Make it sound good.
right? If it is, that's its telos, that's its goal, its end mission. It's where it's moving to. It's supposed to. If the microphone then malfunctions and it ceases to record our audio for a podcast, which I think has happened, it is no longer a microphone. It's built to be a microphone. It is.
It's not a new thing.
It's not a new thing. It's just worthless because it's not the microphone.
It's a not a thing.
It's a not a thing.
It's a broken thing. It's no longer a thing.
Yeah. And that is really what's unique about the Orthodox worldview as well, is that is when you think of, and when you have a theology of evil, so to speak, in that sense, it really clears up the confusion of, well, God has to be the creator of evil, right? I mean, it's a thing, and God, creates everything, and you just collapse when you have an improper view of it.
Yeah, and if you read Cosmic Mystery, which we just mentioned already, but with Maximus the Confessor, he talks also about this idea that evil is like an invention in the mind of man. It is something which we have manifested, but almost an illusion of some sort. It's almost like this belief that evil exists, but in reality it does not, which I think is kind of cool.
It is very interesting you say that. John Crowder is a theologian, author I like as well. He came out of the charismatic movement, if you will, so to speak. But he says that same thing. A lot of times he has a huge love for the fathers. He loves Maximus. But he says that same thing. You almost think of it as an illusion. And that's sort of like when Paul talks about the old self, the old man. You sort of have to wake up to your new identity in Christ and realize that's not a thing. Really, it's the absence of a thing.
Yeah. The death is the absence of life. You know what I mean? And God, who is life, cannot create death. And therefore, sin, sting, right? The sting of death is sin.
Yep.
And sin is something which goes in opposition to God's character. And so God is not at all connected to sin, death, or evil.
Yeah.
Just by his own
So that's
nature.
that's the unique, I'd say, Orthodox view of evil. It's not a dualism between good and evil.
You don't need evil for good to exist.
Exactly.
Good can exist on its own.
That which is truly good, is truly good because it's intrinsically truly good. You don't need the bitter in this sense, so to speak, to realize what the sweet is.
And you could almost argue like a shadow does not need. Oh, well, okay. You could a darkness does not need light to exist, right? But light, light does not need darkness to exist.
I think that's what
I was going to say.
Interpreting it as.
Yeah, light does not need darkness to exist. God does not need evil to exist. However, evil needs light to exist. Like a shadow gains its substance from light.
Again, right? Isn't it? It's that idea almost of like you can't have a crooked line until you know what the straight line is.
Exactly.
Right? It is that same thing.
A shadow gains strength, and that's why when there is something like a good God which governs, that's the only way evil can exist, because the shadow is created by the light, but you do not need the opposite. And that's why in heaven, we can still maintain free will, but it's a choice of multiple goods with no necessary evil within it. So there's no evil in heaven.
Real quick, can we talk? So that, again, that's the unique Orthodox view. It's not dualistic. Can we talk quickly about some other more dualistic views of evil, even from within Christian sects, that sort of thing? Because
don't say sex. This is for children.
Christian sex.
It's a children's podcast.
Hot, holy, and heaven bound.
SECT. Sect.
So that's not the belief and maybe necessarily what I grew up thinking. So that's not what you would say maybe every Christian, unfortunately, adheres to. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't think you'd be far off from saying that.
And I think it finds its root. We talk a lot about Zoroastrianism, we talk about Gnosticism, but they believe that the God of the Jews was this evil, almost like material God who created the universe. But the reason suffering exists is because, well, that God's kind of evil. And then there's the Aeon, right? This like beautiful spiritual God who Christ basically comes to introduce us to. And we find our escape from the material world into the spiritual
Weird
world.
When Christ quotes the Old Testament, though, huh? They kind of break it down with that, right?
Yeah, I think their argument kind of falls apart. But that said, a lot of this Gnosticism gets kind of sucked into some Christian theology through, in our opinion, certain people like Augustine and people who had a lot of that influence accidentally kind of blend a little bit of that into their Christianity.
Yeah, just because they come with those presuppositions, that sort of thing. And you can even see that with popular darlings like John MacArthur, correct, right? We are, again, as we were talking about before, if you're just going to John MacArthur's church, which he did, grew up there.
Yeah. You stumble in there by accident? Or how'd that happen?
He woke up and he's like, this is darkness. No.
Free will, like on your own?
If you're listening to speak, we would have nothing but great things to learn from that man in many ways. But I think when he, in representing sort of this more deterministic worldview of Calvinism, of even farther back a little bit more like Augustinianism, this idea of the problem of evil, to him, he's coming from the framework that God, he wouldn't say creates evil, but wills evil. But again, it's a little bit more dualistic for him. And even one of his sermons on the problem of evil, he does say there is some truth to the idea that to realize how good God is, we do kind of need the evil, which again, we would say no to that. St. Maximus the Confessor would say no to that because the true and the good, we know is the true and the good because it's the true and the good.
Yeah. The argument is that there's certain attributes of God which would never have been manifest if it weren't for evil, such as his mercy, right? Except for such as his justice. And certain things, even holiness, you wouldn't necessarily, according to their argument, understand truly unless you knew what unholiness was. And therefore, God almost like willed evil into existence in order to show more fully his true attributes.
Yeah.
The problem with that stance is that you end up basically saying then that in order for God to be good, evil has to exist, which then almost binds God's free will and makes him predetermined, makes him fatalistic.
It's dualism again.
Like tied to this almost yin-yang Eastern mysticism.
Yeah, and then that kind of gets, I forget his first name, his last name is Hicks, and it's with the theodicies into the soul theodicy.
Yes,
it's the idea that to take from the modern day prophesier Kanye West, that which don't kill you makes you stronger.
He stole that from Nietzsche.
Unless that thing that makes you stronger also can kill you, which sometimes evil does. But so that's Hicks's theodicy is. Why does God let bad things happen? Well, it's this idea that this world is designed to make us stronger, and these evils are designed to build our characters so that in the end we have something to overcome.
Yep.
But then you get into the idea of, well, why didn't God just make the least minimum evil? Why didn't God just make paper cuts and stubbing your toe instead of babies dying, rolling off of tables, or all these things?
John Hick.
I thought it was John, but I also
John
went
too.
Paul.
It's interesting too because when I was first encountering that the soul theodicy, it almost sounded like a kind of an interesting, like strange, if you will, offshoot of theosis, or the reason that our suffering can be redeemed. But I think, as well, Alex, if you want to touch on sort of Irenaeus' view of it's similar to that. When you say, I think John Hick sort of picks up on the Irenaean theodicy as well.
Yeah, Irenaeus is fantastic. Again, I totally recommend reading his book Against Heresies. It's 5 separate books that are all kind of punched into one, and he's battling this Gnostic idea. But in that, I think it's book 4, near the end, in a 30 to 40 chapter range, he talks about basically his argument for why we were created imperfect. And so versus people like Augustine, maybe, who argue that humanity was created perfect and then we fell from this grace in
paradise,
the fall.
Completely perfect.
Exactly. Yeah. The fall really isn't even a phrase or a term until Augustine. He coins the phrase the fall. And he believed that before the term was always paradise, but we don't know what that means. All I have to say is Irenaeus believed that while humanity was innocent, as in they had not yet sinned, they were not at all perfect. And he used this kind of philosophical understanding to say, well, something which creates is always greater than the thing at which it creates. And something which is infinite has no beginning, yet something which is finite, such as humanity, has a starting point.
Yep.
And something which starts is finite and therefore infantile. You know what I mean? He's
Yeah.
infantile. So yeah, so they are infantile.
Omnipotent.
So yeah, since we have a starting point, we are infantile at some point, and that which is just began needs to progress in order to achieve perfection, whereas something which is infinite is perfect on its own. So God basically introduces suffering and these kind of things into the world as trials, not evil, but as challenges to overcome. Even such as, tending the garden and things like that, which are meant to perfect us. And same with the knowledge of good and evil, right? The tree. He put this tree there in order to test us, in order to help us persevere over our free choice and therefore choose right.
Yeah.
A baby isn't virtuous. A baby's just innocent, right? Until something can choose right and wrong and chooses right, they aren't yet perfect. And therefore, Irenaeus kind of taught that humanity's been brought through this stage of development between receiving milk and receiving mushed food until solid food.
Yeah.
And the goal of humanity is a slow progression towards perfection, which is what we would refer to as theosis, which is the slowly becoming more and more unified to the divine energies and of God himself.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
That
Yeah.
makes sense.
I think, is it Matt Fradd that says you're not virtuous because you are peaceful or whatever?
I think it's Jordan Peterson, actually.
Is it Jordan
He
Peterson?
does say that,
So
yeah.
Matt stole from Jordan?
He probably
Matt probably
did.
said it, yeah. It's a thing.
Yeah. But I'm already butchering the quote. So.
Alex said it once, a rabbit isn't virtuous because it doesn't kill a lion. It can't kill a lion, right?
You need
And
to
that's the
first
same
be a
thing.
monster and then not act monstrously.
And that's
Carry
the
a
thing,
large
too.
sword and use it properly.
Everything, of course, that God creates is good. We have those on the 6 days of creation. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a good creation. It is good to know the difference between good and evil and to choose that which is not evil. But if you're thinking of Irenaeus' view here, am I getting correct when saying God introduces suffering? Our human ancestors have failed that test, as have we, and we chose to partake of the knowledge of good and evil in an incorrect manner, too soon, ways we couldn't handle it, that sort of thing. It introduces the privation of the good.
Yeah, and Irenaeus uses the example of Jonah, which again, sometimes God's punishments or disciplines, as it says in Hebrews, are a result of our free will decisions.
Yeah.
So Jonah chose to rebel against God, and therefore God introduced suffering into his life through the being swallowed by a whale. Yet through that suffering, a greater good came. The entire city of Nineveh repented. And
Even
Jonah
the animals
himself,
fasted.
Even the animals were fasting. And even Jonah himself was then brought into closer communion with God. So Irenaeus always believes that suffering is meant to drive us towards God.
You guys know many people have said, I don't know who the source is, but the story of the horse, the man and his horse, the boy and his horse. For those, Alex, I don't know if you know, but for those who don't, it's been told many
been a while
different ways,
since I've
but
been reading
it's
my
this
Chinese
idea
proverbs.
that I'll do it, I'll break it down, I'll paraphrase it. It can kind of go as long as you want it to go, but
Let's
the
keep it
idea
short.
that this man had a farm, he had a horse that was something happened and the horse was killed, and the townspeople came to him and said, "That's really a shame. What happened?" He goes, "Well, who knows? Who knows what's good and what's evil?" Townspeople heard about this. They gave him 3 more horses. They go, "Wow, look at you! You now have 3 horses to tend to your farm. How great is that?" He goes, "Well, I don't know. Who knows what's good and what's evil?" His son decides, "I'm going to go ride this horse." Son rides the horse, falls off, breaks his leg. They go, "Wow, that's a shame. What happened to your son?" He goes, "Who knows what's good and what's evil?"
I can see why this can go on
The
forever.
army comes and goes to draft him. But they can't because he has a broken leg. And they go, "That's fantastic. Your son is free of this." He goes, "Who knows what's good and what's evil?"
Yeah.
It's this idea that there are so many things that happen to us that we cannot see what the outcome is going to be. And obviously that doesn't mean fight the injustices that you see and, determine what is evil. There's certain things that are intrinsic, whatever.
So how many times was that? Was that 3 times?
Whoa!
This is not one.
Who knows what's good and what's
There are
bad?
so many
Who
things
knows
that are
what's
evil
stuttering?
and that should be fault,
Say the
right?
word.
I don't
Say the
wanna.
word.
I don't want to.
Say it.
I don't want to.
Say it.
I'm not gonna.
Read this word here.
Worth.
Intrinsic would be the word.
Intrinsic. Yeah.
Spell it for me.
Intrinsic.
Can you use it in a
Intrinsically,
sentence?
yeah.
Good
I
job.
said
You
it.
got. You've said it before.
What
I'll
a
say it
point that
again.
you just said, which I think
That
is
stroke. Who knows if it was good or bad? So
Well, yeah.
Something you just mentioned, which is kind of a good point too, which I just want to briefly touch on, is you said
mad at myself,
when you look
though.
back and you see, for example, you broke your leg, now you don't get drafted, now you don't get killed. The whole hindsight's 2020. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Great Divorce, which is a fantastic book. It's pretty short and it deals with these people who are basically in hell, these
a fun
spirits,
one.
and they're going to heaven on these little trips, and then they can either choose to continue staying in heaven or go back to hell. But he basically makes the argument that eternity works backwards. So if you end up in heaven, all the trials of your life leading up to that become heaven, because you see them as a step in the chain that gets you there. In the same way as if you go to hell eventually, every moment on earth becomes hell to you, because it's another step in the direction of hell. And therefore, the things which at the moment seemed suffering, seemed painful, seemed evil, when you ultimately get to heaven, you'll see them as things which got you there, and therefore you'll see them as beautiful. You can imagine, like, if I'm on my way to a nice, to an appointment, some interview, and I spill hot coffee on myself, and my shirt's ruined. I'm pissed, all this stuff. Well, then I have to go to the supermarket quick and grab a shirt. And in doing so, the girl checking me out.
At the supermarket?
I don't know where I'm going.
They have like
I
go the county.
I know
shirts,
your wife shops at Aldi.
I strap some coconuts on, and all to say is the person selling me the product is this beautiful girl. We get in a conversation. I end up marrying her. In the long run, you're going to look back and actually be thankful for that experience, despite the fact it caused momentary suffering. And likewise, in eternity, we will look back.
When you find out the job you were applying for was a secret sex cult, and it's like, well, it's a good thing I didn't go there, right?
But some of this argument of suffering is very much just done away with when you take eternity into it.
And that's the thing too. That is the hope of the Christian worldview: is you make it to the eschaton, right? You are deified in the end, and you can say, "Now I get it. Now I see the reasons behind it, and here I've been rewarded for how I suffered well." Right? And that is a hope that won't make sense if you're not adhering to that worldview. But it's not supposed to make sense.
And for the disciples of Jesus, for those who, the early church, go back as far as you want, right? Suffering was just expected in this life.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that was like, well, obviously, like the book of Job it's a great one to read if you want to,
the oldest book in the Bible.
Read about suffering and everything. But it was this idea that, like, we're not surprised that there's suffering. We're not surprised that there's these trials. It's the idea that, hey, this is life and this is what's going to happen. But how do we approach that? And Jesus didn't come to do away with suffering, but he came to walk with people through their suffering.
And that's the thing too with Job. You don't really get an answer on it, right?
You kind of leave with more questions.
And I don't think, even now we can be lacking in answers, but we do see Christ, and now we see the end goal of our deification, in a sense that we will eternally grow into. So Christ is, in some sense, the answer to the problem of Job, even though it isn't necessarily, even though the Word is the answer. There's a word for it, logos, the eternal logos of God, right? But it's not necessarily written out for us in a neat fashion that we can argue and debate with. But we do have the answer through the Word, which is Christ prefiguring our eventual deification. So there is that hope as the Christian, even though,
some people talk about evil almost like God's up there like torturing us, but we do have a God who entered into suffering, and through that, and that also is a good example to show that God is not necessarily the author of evil or suffering, in the sense that Christ entered into humanity in order to suffer, in order to destroy suffering. Yeah. Right? And again, Jesus wouldn't be trying to destroy a system which he himself set up. Right?
Yeah.
But here's a couple verses which I think are great, which are from the scriptures. It says,
the Bible,
I know, right? 1 Peter, he says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin." Colossians, Paul says, "Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you. Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regards to Christ's afflictions, for the sake of his body, which is the church." Or James says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. For having stood the test, that person will receive a crown of life." In Philippians, he says, this is Paul also, he says, "I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him even in his death." And there are a lot of these. All to say is, the Bible's like, dude, suffering is good. Engage the suffering. Pull the suffering onto you. Take up your cross. Peterson says the goal of life is to some extent, bear your suffering, bear the sufferings of the world voluntarily. And so the Christian worldview says, yes, there's suffering, and try to get more of it, right? Try to bring more suffering on yourself.
Yeah.
Not pointlessly,
and
but
again,
in order
too,
to help others.
That's the idea, because we can say, well, God hasn't willed evil. I don't know if we're saying God hasn't willed suffering. I haven't thought through that enough, right? So it depends. But let's say God has...
He's willed trials, you might
willed trials, yeah.
Well, he's willed labor and work. You should say growth. God is a working God.
Yeah, some sort of tension which can lead to growth, right?
There we go. Let's go with that.
Just whittling it down here.
We'll figure that out later.
But... yeah, you make a great point there, because, now we find ourselves on the opposite end of where in each one of our lives we have chosen to turn away from being itself, to turn away from the good. So in the midst of that now, because that's where we find ourselves, in reality, everybody can easily look out on the street and see that evil is done to people. God is now redeeming that evil. Even if we can say he didn't will that, that's not his original plan. In light of it, he is now redeeming it. And now, as Paul says, all of our sufferings, we're more than conquerors through it, because they're pretty much our slaves. Like, it serves me. I don't just have mastery over it, but I have mastery over it, and it also benefits me. Nakedness, famine, so on and so forth, because I become more like Christ for it. And in the end, my deification is so great. I will shine like the sun, as Jesus says.
It's the idea of, we were talking earlier, God's perfect will and his permissive will. His perfect will is anything that is good, beautiful, truth, wisdom. When you figure out a truth of life, that is God's perfect will. When you realize that, hey, there is so much beauty in the world, that is God's perfect will. His permissive will is, evil happens. A baby gets cancer and dies. That is not part of God's perfect plan. He does not want that to happen, but it doesn't thwart his plan at all. He's not thrown off guard by that, and he will use it to bring about his goodness and bring about his glory. And to me, there are two reasons why I think God retains our free will, and I touched on that one briefly. It's, I think, the idea that God he deems the retention of our freedom as the greater good, even if that means sacrificing a momentary suspense of our freedom for security and safety. He, some reason, deems our freedom as the greater good. And two, I think the reason why God won't violate our free will is he knows, again, he can bring about a greater good through evil. And think about it, what was the worst evil in history? We killed the Son of God. We killed the perfect Son of God who did nothing wrong, and we decided, no, we're going to murder you. And through that, the best thing in human history happened, that God saved us. And so I think those are the two main reasons why God deems our free will as something that he wants to retain.
Yeah.
Basically, if you look at the world and you see something which seems to be like directly contrary to what God would want, it probably is. Why do we keep playing these games like, oh, you were hit by a drunk driver and almost lost your life and spent 6 months in the hospital? God probably did that. It's like, dude, that is just obviously hell. Let's just start with, again, I'm not saying every situation. Some situations maybe are disciplines from God, but if you see something that just seems directly contrary, like a kid getting leukemia, how about this? That's not God. You know what I mean? How about, like, if it's so obvious to you as a mortal, sinful human, then why do we even play with the idea that this could be God, right?
And it doesn't mean he's not going to redeem the situation and do something great. That is what redeeming means. But he didn't give your son the cancer.
No, your cells are mutating. They are what? They're misdirecting. They are misusing. They're not living into their proper telos. Your cells are rebelling against God. That's what's going on at the physical.
That's good,
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
hit yourself.
Yeah. Evil, natural evil.
And I think we do got to be careful too with this game where people go, well, couldn't God have had less evil, right? Why do we have this? It's one thing to have some evil, some trials, but what about like the Holocaust? Was that necessary?
Yeah.
The problem is it's kind of like with a kid, how they cry like crazy over like dropping a binky. Like if the world were to if God just notched the evil down by like 10%, well then the most evil thing in that world would now be to us equally traumatic.
Sure.
So if God removed 99% of evil, just me saying not saying hi to you or putting a period at the end of my text message could be legitimately like the Hitler of that world.
There weren't as many smiley faces in that.
Well, seriously though, it'd be like the worst evil committed would always be the worst evil that you could perceive, and therefore a flick on the wrist or running a stoplight could suddenly be like Hitler level, right? And so you got to be careful too, where it's like it becomes this almost like God is this surveillance system that's monitoring you every day, every second, and if you disobey, he smacks you on the wrist. You know what I mean? It's like that's equally detrimental to free will, and therefore God has to, in order to bring about the ultimate good, allow for ultimate evil to exist in the meantime, right? But it's the vehicle by which we access God and through unity to Him.
That's good.